The sky over Dust Creek Hollow was unusually quiet the morning they buried Caleb Boone. A low wind moved through the cottonwoods, rustling leaves like whispers from the past. The townsfolk had heard about his death the night before, found cold and still near the edge of Miller's Gulch, with nothing but a tattered coat and a whiskey bottle by his side. No one asked too many questions. No one offered prayers. To most, Caleb Boone was just another nameless drifter, one of many who wandered through the plains with no story worth remembering. He came into town months ago, kept to himself, lived in the abandoned blacksmith's shed, and never bothered anyone. But he never earned their trust either. People said he had shifty eyes, that he spoke like a man hiding something. They said his silence was louder than most folks' sins. So, when the preacher announced his burial at the edge of the churchyard, not a single soul in town seemed to care. Not the barkeep, not the sheriff, not even the gravedigger who muttered complaints as he shoveled the hard earth. Except for her. Lydia Rose. An elderly woman dressed in faded gray, with a silver pin in her hair and hands that trembled as she clutched a small object no one could see. She walked slow, steady, alone, and stood at the foot of the grave, as the preacher recited verses that felt more like formality than faith. She was the only one who cried. Not loud, not wailing. Just quiet tears that rolled down her face and soaked into the dry dust at her feet. The kind of grief that doesn't ask for attention, only remembrance. When the last words were spoken and the dirt was shoveled back over Caleb Boone's casket, she placed something on the mound, a rusted locket, its chain broken, its clasp long worn. Then she turned and walked away without a word, disappearing down the path like a shadow carried by the wind. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked why she came. But that night, whispers began to stir in Dust Creek Hollow, the kind that cling to walls and slip through keyholes. Why did she cry for him? And more importantly, who was he really? By the next morning, the wind in Dust Creek Hollow carried more than dust, it carried questions. The kind that echo quietly, but land heavy in people's minds. Why would Lydia Rose, the quiet, graceful woman who ran the seamstress shop near the church for over 30 years, cry for a man like Caleb Boone? Most folks hadn't given the drifter more than a passing glance when he was alive. Some said he had a scar on his cheek that looked like a knife had once kissed it. Others claimed he muttered in his sleep behind the blacksmith's shed. One thing was certain: he kept to himself, spoke to no one, and left no trace of who he really was. But Lydia's tears changed that. By midday, gossip buzzed like flies around a summer corpse. At the general store, on the church steps, inside the barber shop, folks were no longer talking about who Caleb wasn't. Now they were wondering who he might have been. Some said Lydia must have mistaken him for someone else. Others whispered that maybe he had done her wrong in the past. A few, the kind who liked their rumors bitter, even suggested a scandal, a secret love, a hidden shame. But none of them dared to ask Lydia herself. She said nothing, went about her daily routine as if nothing had happened. But anyone who watched closely could see it. Her eyes were heavier, her steps slower, as if carrying a weight long buried, and now freshly unearthed. That's when Eli Matthews, a young boy who stocked shelves at the dry goods store, spoke up. He was there at the funeral, not to mourn, but to deliver supplies to the preacher. And he saw what most missed. He saw Lydia place the broken locket on Caleb's grave. Not flowers, not a note. A locket, old, rusted, and dull, but clearly cherished, and it stuck in Eli's mind like a thorn. Why a locket? Why that man? And more importantly, Why now? The questions clung to the town like the dust that never settled. No one could answer them, but one thing was clear. Caleb Boone may have died a stranger, but he left behind a mystery that refused to stay buried. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Dust Creek Hollow, the truth had begun to stir. Eli Matthews couldn't let it go. Something about that funeral had gripped him, not the man in the coffin, but the tears of the woman who cried for him. Lydia Rose had always seemed like a part of the town itself. Dependable, kind, quietly present. She belonged to Dust Creek Hollow, the way old trees belong to soil deeply rooted and weather-worn, but her sorrow didn't feel like a passing sadness. It felt lived in, old, personal. And so, when the workday was slow and the shop quiet, Eli began to look. At first, it was harmless curiosity, a glance through old newspaper clippings in the back of the church library, a few dusty boxes in the town archives, mentions of ranch hands, rail workers, and cattle thieves. None of it pointed to Caleb Boone, until one name began to surface, faint, scattered, and almost lost to time. Jonah Reed, a ranch hand who once worked for the Cartwright family nearly 35 years ago. He disappeared after a fire destroyed one of the barns on the outskirts of Dust Creek. 3 men had died inside. The town was shaken. Some claimed arson, others claimed accident. But one thing was certain. Jonah Reed was never seen again after that night. And though he had been listed as a suspect, no charges were ever filed. The case had quietly vanished, just like the man. Eli leaned in closer. The description matched: tall, lean, sharp-jawed, with a scar along his left cheek, the same one Caleb Boone had. Could it be? He kept digging. Found an old, grainy photo in the bottom of a crumbling ledger. A group of men lined up outside the Cartwright ranch house. The faces were hard to make out, faded by time. But one figure stood slightly apart from the rest, unsmiling, distant and familiar in a way Eli couldn't shake. Caleb Boone or Jonah Reed. And then came the final piece, a letter dated 1889, unsigned, found in Lydia Rose's old scrapbook at the town hall donation drive. It had been slipped between pages, almost as if someone had hidden it there. The writing was shaky. The ink nearly vanished. But the words were clear. I'm sorry I left. I thought silence would protect you. I never stopped loving you. No name, no address, just time-worn regret. Eli knew then that this wasn't just a story of a drifter and a locket. This was a forgotten life buried beneath dust, shame, and time. Caleb Boone was no drifter. He was Jonah Reed, and Lydia had never forgotten him. The truth didn't come with a bang. It came like dust settling after a storm. Quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. When Eli Matthews brought his findings to the preacher, and then to Lydia Rose, she didn't deny a word. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded, as if the weight of carrying the truth had finally worn her down enough to let it fall. And for the first time in decades, she spoke of Jonah Reed. Not the drifter, not the accused arsonist, but the man she had once loved with all the fire of her youth. He had been a quiet soul, she said. Not perfect, not loud, but kind. He worked hard, spoke little, and often stayed late just to see her walking home from the churchyard. In a town that had no patience for slow courtships, they had built something rare, something real. But Dust Creek Hollow was not kind to love that didn't fit its rules. The Cartwright fire changed everything. 3 men dead, a barn turned to ash, and rumors like wildfire fast, hot, and cruel. Jonah was blamed before the smoke had even cleared. No trial, no defense, just a quiet sentence from the court of public opinion. Lydia knew the truth even then. Jonah hadn't started the fire. It was Wade Cartwright, the youngest son of the landowner. Jealous, reckless and angry, after Lydia had turned him down. He'd seen her with Jonah, and in a fit of pride and spite, set the blaze, never meaning to kill anyone, never thinking it would spread that fast. But when the bodies were pulled from the wreckage, Wade vanished into silence, and Jonah, not wanting to drag Lydia through the mud, took the blame without a word. He left that very night, disappeared into the plains, carrying nothing but a broken heart and the promise that he would never return to ruin her name. And for 35 years she waited. Waited for news, a letter, a sign, anything. But there was nothing. Just time. Just the memory of a man who had loved her enough to disappear. Until the day he died, as Caleb Boone alone, forgotten and buried under a name that wasn't his. The town had moved on, but Lydia never did. She kept his memory alive in silence. Never married. Never left, and when the locket, the one he'd once given her, was finally placed back in his hands, she let the years fall from her heart in the form of tears. Not for the drifter they all thought he was, but for the man only she had truly known. The town had buried him as a nobody, a nameless drifter, a shadow in the shape of a man. But truth, like the prairie wind, has a way of finding cracks to slip through. After Lydia Rose spoke, the silence in Dust Creek Hollow became something different, not quiet from indifference, but quiet from shame. The townsfolk who once whispered judgments now stood still with something heavier pressing on their hearts. The weight of a man they never truly saw. Jonah Reed had died without forgiveness, without honor, without even his name. But now the story had changed. The preacher, the same one who had muttered a rushed burial prayer, called for a second service. This time, not for Caleb Boone, but for Jonah, the real man, the one who left to protect the woman he loved and bore the shame of a crime he didn't commit. They moved his grave. Not far, but just enough closer to the church, beneath an old willow tree where the sunlight softened in the late afternoon. A small wooden cross was placed above the fresh earth. Nothing fancy, just his true name, carved into cedar. Jonah Reed, 1851 to 1904. He left silently, he loved fiercely, and this time the whole town came. Some stood in guilt, others in sorrow. But all of them came to witness the laying to rest of a man who had lived in the shadows and died with the truth buried beside him. Eli Matthews placed the locket gently at the base of the cross, the same locket Lydia had once left behind. Inside, two faded faces smiled forever in a photograph nearly lost to time. A young man and a young woman side by side, unaware of the storm their love would have to weather. Lydia stood back, silent as always, her eyes calm now, not because she had forgotten him, but because she had finally told the world who he truly was. Jonah Reed had returned to Dust Creek Hollow not for justice, but for peace. And now, at last, he had it.